So for this video, it's actually going to be the very first episode in my very long series that I'm going to be doing, which is my favorite albums from each year from the year 1967 all the way up until present day 2024. And basically for each video, for each episode I'm going to be doing, starting with 1967, I'm going to be exploring my favorite albums from that year and ultimately picking my favorite album from that year. So this is going to be a long series. Each episode will vary in length depending on how many albums I actually really love from that year. This first episode might be a bit longer because 1967, arguably one of the greatest years in music history. I do have a lot of albums to talk about, but other years, don't really have that many that I love. Like there's certain years in like the 80s where 80s might be like my least favorite decade of music. So there's not, some of those episodes might be very short. Like I might only mention like a couple of albums here and there. But other years, like 1967 and possibly my favorite year, 1973, I have a lot of albums to shout out. So each episode will vary in length depending on how many albums I like. But, enough of the preamble. Let's go ahead and jump right into it. So like I said, this is episode 1 and the year is 1967. And like I mentioned, arguably one of the best years in music history, especially for rock. There's a lot of not only just our already established bands making arguably their best albums, there's also a lot of debut albums from really great artists here. So let's go ahead and jump into maybe some of my, not like all-time favorites, but some really good ones I will mention here. I Never Loved a Man the Way I Loved You by Aretha Franklin. This is actually a recent listen from me. I, of course heard of her mega hit Respect and then a couple of other songs, but really I haven't really dived deep into Aretha Franklin. But I listened to this album and I really enjoyed it. It has, of course, Respect on it, but it has a bunch of other songs and she's just, one of the best singers of all time. So her music is very good. It's very jazzy and bluesy and just, I love her voice. So I'm definitely going to be checking out more Aretha Franklin. But yeah, this album came out in 1967 and really put her on the map. She had previously done some albums, but they didn't really go anywhere in her career. But she put out this album and people had to pay attention to her. Another album worth mentioning is actually David Bowie's debut album. This album is very weird and eclectic. It's very psychedelic and just kind of weird, kind of like early Pink Floyd-y stuff. It's very weird to hear David Bowie kind of like in that sense, but if you haven't checked it out, it's a pretty quirky album. So if you like kind of like early Pink Floyd, just kind of like weird music, go check this one out. There's also I can't pronounce this word. Serialistic Pillow by Jefferson Airplane. And of course, this has two of their biggest hits on it, White Rabbit and Somebody to Love, which I had always known those songs and loved those songs, but it also has a bunch of other songs I'd never heard of. And of course, with this being 1967, it's pretty psychedelic and pretty all over the place. Some songs, are better than others, but overall, it was a pretty interesting listen. So if you only know those two songs by Jefferson Airplane, definitely check out this album. It's got a lot of cool stuff on it. We also have The Doors, who are one of my all-time favorite bands. They actually released 2 albums in 1967. The first one being, of course, their debut album, The Doors, which is one of the best debut albums of all time and just arguably one of the most influential rock albums of all time. It's obviously got Break On Through to the Other Side, Light My Fire, The End, but it's got a lot of cool deep cuts on it as well. So if you like The Doors but really only know their greatest hits, definitely check out this album. It's their best in my opinion. And also they have their other album, Strange Days. I like it a little less than The Doors, but it does have some really cool songs. It's got the hits like Love Me 2 Times and People Are Strange, which is one of my favorites, and When the Music's Over, the long epic song. But it's got some cool deep cuts on it too, like Moonlight Drive and My Eyes Have Seen You, Strange Days. So really cool album, and it's pretty cool that they were able to release 2 albums in 1967. A lot of bands from like the 60s were able to sometimes release 2 or even 3 albums in the same year, which by today's standards is pretty nuts. So pretty cool. And speaking of speaking of bands that released multiple albums a year, the Beatles. You have 1967, you've got Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which is actually my personal favorite Beatles album, and probably my second favorite album from 1967. Just, if you haven't listened to Sgt. Pepper's, do yourself a favor. Of course, it's got Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, With a Little Help from My Friends, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, Getting Better, A Day in the Life, and actually my personal favorite Beatles song, which is a very deep cut, often cited as the worst on the album, but I love it, Lovely Rita. This album just is perfect from start to finish in my mind. Really good album. And then, of course, they have their second album that they did that year, Magical Mystery Tour. I like it a little bit less, but it's still got some mega hits on it. You've obviously got the title track, Magical Mystery Tour, but you've also got I Am the Walrus, which is just a really quirky song, Hello Goodbye, Strawberry Fields Forever, Penny Lane, Baby You're a Rich Man, All You Need Is Love. And then you got some deep tracks like that get pretty psychedelic. The Fool on the Hill, Flying, Blue Jay Way, and Your Mother Should Know. So pretty cool album. If you haven't checked it out, definitely check it out. And speaking of psychedelic, one of my favorite bands of all time also debuted in 1967, Pink Floyd with The Pipers at the Gates of Dawn. Not one of my all-time favorite Pink Floyd albums, but it's definitely worth a listen if you love Pink Floyd and haven't really checked out their earlier stuff. Very psychedelic, very just weird and quirky songs on here, like The Gnome and Bike and Astronomy Domine. What else is on here? You've got The Scarecrow, Take Up Thy Stethoscope and Walk. And then, of course, you've got like the mega, I won't say hit, but like a song that put them on the map, Interstellar Overdrive, which is very psychedelic, long, almost 10-minute song. So a lot of cool stuff on this album. You've also got Cream's second album, which I can never really pronounce, Disraeli Gears. It's this album. It's got some of their best songs on here, including probably their most popular, Sunshine of Your Love. It's also got some cool songs like Strange Brew, Dance the Night Away, Tales of Brave Ulysses, and just one that's just spelled SWLABR. Pretty cool stuff in here. But then we get to my favorite album from 1967. It was kind of hard to choose between this one and Sgt. Pepper's, but I'm going to ultimately go with Are You Experienced by the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Also a debut album from 1967. And of course, Jimi Hendrix, legendary guitarist, probably my second or third favorite guitarist behind like Jimmy Page and John Petrucci. You know, Jimi Hendrix is a legend for a reason. And when this album came out, it blew a lot of people away with the mix of blues and psychedelic and just hard rock. And it's just a fantastic album. It does have some hits on it. Of course, you've got Purple Haze, you've got Hey Joe, The Wind Cries Mary, Fire, Foxy Lady, Red House, Stone Free. You've got all of that, but you've got really cool songs on here, like Manic Depression, May This Be Love, Third Stone from the Sun, Highway Child, excuse me, Can You See Me? So it's a pretty lengthy album too. It's got 17 songs. It's really good. And not only is it one of the best guitar albums of all time, because it's Jimi Hendrix, but it's also just one of the best drum albums of all time. Because Mitch Mitchell is a very underrated drummer, very overshadowed by, of course, Jimi Hendrix. But yeah, it's one of the best albums. It's definitely, well, I won't say definitely, but it's my favorite album from 1967, but it's also just one of my favorite albums from the 1960s in general. One of the best rock albums of all time. All right, so that is my favorite albums from the year 1967. You've got all different kinds of stuff happening. Like I mentioned, you've got Aretha Franklin, you've got David Bowie's debut album, you've got Serialistic Pillow by Jefferson Airplane, you've got two Doors albums, the debut, The Doors, and Strange Days. You've got Pipers at the Gates of Dawn, another debut. You've got Cream's second album, Disraeli Gears. You've got the Beatles with 2 albums, Sgt. Pepper's and Magical Mystery Tour. But then you've got Jimi Hendrix, Are You Experienced, which is ultimately my favorite from the year 1967. So please let me know if you agree with me, and let me know what are your favorite albums from the year 1967. I'd love to chat with you about it in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for watching. Like and subscribe and all that jazz, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you guys so much, and have a fantastic day.